Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens with your host, Jake and Scott. And today we are in NuLu, in a city not so far away. Yes, that's where the hippies are. And we are at the Last Refuge here in downtown Louisville, the new destination for all things Heaven's Door, Bob Dylan, and we're going to explore what that looks like with national brand ambassador Adam Edwards here shortly. So sit back and buckle into the latest episode of the Bourbon Lens. Adam, and for our listeners, this is the second time we're recording this podcast right now because of a snafu. So we're not going to go through everything we just talked about, but we will talk about the main brand points. But how are you, man?
I'm really good. I'm kind of sad that we're not going to talk about Big Red again, but
it's okay. If anyone wants to know, I went on a tangent about how you should explore brands and talk about the things that you're passionate about, like Kroger Boost, and we talked about Taco Bell and then White Castle and how White Castle needs Big Red, and then Adam said that he likes Big Blue, even though it's not just because he's a Kentucky fan and there's a lot more ingredients in it. So if you want the Cliff Notes version, there it is. But the most important thing is that we're here and we're sitting in this beautiful church in NuLu that kind of really puts the stamp on the end of NuLu. And thanks for having us down here.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you guys having me on again. It's nice to reconnect with you all. I know I've been on two times. Yeah.
You gave us our initial tour at Rabbit Hole, and then we did a podcast, and then you set us up with Kaveh, and you sat in on the podcast, and he tried to throw you a few questions, and you were like, "Nah, it's your podcast."
Yeah, right.
I was gonna say he was in like the first 100, he was in the second 100, and now he'll be in the third 100.
Right. I kind of like the way that goes.
Yeah. There we go.
So he'll be in the 1,000th episode, so he'll make his 10th appearance in the 1,000th episode, and
just keep on being part of brands, man.
It's like once every 10 years.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it feels like episodes go by and Scott's like, "Oh, the 300th episode's coming up." And I'm like, he's like, "What you thinking about doing?" I'm like, "I don't know. What are you thinking about doing?"
Shit, it'll be here before we know it. It's like less than 2 months away.
Wow.
I don't know. It's like one of those things. It's like, you got to celebrate these things. It's like, how many monumental things have I done in bourbon and whiskey? More than I can count, actually.
I just remember looking back at like episode 50, and I was like, we gotta do something for episode 50 because most podcasts die after like 6.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, that's, I think, you've done the media thing, and you mentioned earlier, like there's some people that aren't even doing this. Here we are, almost. The podcast will have started 6 years ago with a dream between Michael Burton and Scott and myself. I wasn't at the cigar bar when this happened, but I was in from the beginning. September of 2015, 2016?
No, 2018.
September 2018. That's wild.
I mean, 2018, that might as well be like 1992, man.
Exactly.
That was like 3 generations of children ago.
Gas prices were a lot cheaper then.
I think everything was a lot cheaper.
Inflation. God bless America. And no place else. That's a Chris Rock reference, if you have not, from the next president, when Chris Rock runs for president. Bernie Mac's the vice president. Yeah, and that's
golly.
Oh man, what a good movie. If you're looking for great movies, that's good. And we also talked about how I just recently watched Dodgeball, and you gotta go back and watch Dodgeball. Like it's so good.
I watched. Speaking of throwback, Jurassic Park, 1994.
The original?
Such a good movie.
Watched that last night. Hold on to your butts.
Jeff Goldblum, man. That's Jeff at its finest.
Yeah, absolutely.
When he's laying there after having his leg almost ripped off.
Yeah, people got like tattoos of that. That is in my top 10 of all time movies.
Yeah,
is Jurassic Park.
Yeah,
I feel like you have to see that movie. Everybody has to see that movie.
I was glad I went back and watched it.
It holds up really well.
So that you bringing up a great point, because we're going to talk about an iconic musician here with Heaven's Door. So what is a movie that, in your opinion, everyone has to watch?
Believe it or not, Jurassic Park. But I'm not saying that just because you brought that up and I can't think of it. That is the Jurassic Park, Jaws. I think everybody you have to see Jaws.
You don't have to see Jaws 2, but you can see Jaws 1.
Jaws 2, you can leave. The Revenge of Jaws or whatever. Now you got to see Jaws. I'm a big Spielberg guy. I mean, I know there's
an easy one. Yeah.
The guys, I mean, and also as a musician, I'm a John Williams guy. Like John Williams, without John Williams, I don't think Steven Spielberg would be nearly is iconic, right? Without John Williams, the music has made so many of those movies. But Jurassic Park is such a perfect movie. There's like very little plot holes, which when you go back and you look at a movie from the early 90s, at this point, you can usually tear them apart. There's not a lot of plot holes in that. It's better than the book, which is saying something, because that's a great book. But yeah, Jurassic Park, you have to see Jurassic Park. You have to see Jurassic Park.
Yeah, I mean, that was the kicker, because I started reading the book,
Yeah.
and then I was like, I got to go back and watch the movie first.
The book is difficult. And there's like pages upon pages of like code.
Yeah.
It was great.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing with Andromeda Strain. It was just, there's a lot of data in that book. But nah, Jurassic Park, I think you have to be able to see that. You have to see that movie. You have to see Jaws. And then 50 Shades of Grey is really rounds out the top 3 for me.
Well, didn't see that one coming.
That took a left turn. Scott, what about you? What's a movie you think everyone has to watch?
Oh, this sounds so weird, but it's just because it's my favorite movie, but it's American Psycho.
Yeah. He loves some American Psycho.
But it creeps people out when you tell them that's your favorite movie.
I always think about it when I give someone my business card.
Yeah. That's great.
It's a good scene.
Yeah.
For me, it's definitely Shawshank Redemption. You got to sit down and you got to watch that. I think, as like polarizing as this should be, you should watch Forrest Gump for the pure enjoyment of it. I think it's a phenomenal movie.
I'd probably appreciate it a lot more now than when I first watched it.
Oh, Forrest Gump, like if you can find the DVD or find the streaming of it, like when you don't have to watch it on the 2 VHSs, it's absolutely phenomenal because you like see so much of the history of what was happening at that time.
Great soundtrack too. Really good soundtrack in that flick.
One of the best of all time.
Yeah. And I think, speaking of big time people, I think you have to watch the original Star Wars. Yeah, like for what they were able to do in the 70s to make that movie. And then in modern day, you have to watch all the John Wick series. Because there's nobody that's killed people quite like John Wick has.
This is very true. This is very true. I did just go see Deadpool yesterday, and I gotta say some of the deaths in that movie were very creative.
Mr. Wick.
Probably not the best of all time movie, but
it was not bad though. It was pretty funny. It was pretty good.
Yeah. Oh man. Okay, so now that brings me to a question. What is a record or album that is a must listen for you? Because that's going to tie into the brand.
Definitely. So I could say Blonde on Blonde by Bob Dylan is my favorite Dylan record and is probably one of the greatest albums ever created. But, and I feel like I have to, with Heaven's Door, I got to say a Bob Dylan record because you have to bring Bob Dylan into it, right? He's one of the greatest of all time. But Brandi Carlile, she put an album out. I want to say this is probably, maybe 10 years ago in the last decade. And it's a live album that she did with the Seattle Symphony. I think it's Benaroya Hall is the name of that. And it's just Brandi Carlile live with the Seattle Symphony. And it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. I was already a huge Brandi Carlile fan. But after listening to that record, it really shows you the power of the human voice and how it really can act as an instrument. It's not just about the song. I mean, she's an incredible songwriter. She's an incredible musician. She's an incredible guitar player. The 2 guys that she has with her all the time, Phil and Tim Hansroth, are amazing. They're incredible musicians as well. Great band for her. But just listening to her voice when she's singing along with like, the cellos and the French horns playing together, like she blends with the orchestra, and it blew my mind the first time I was. I've probably listened to that album more than any other album in my entire life.
Wow. I know Scott's answers Huey Lewis in the news.
Yeah. Honestly, it's any music you like on vinyl.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, that's the true answer. It's like whatever music you like, if you can find it on vinyl, listen to it on vinyl, and you're going to appreciate it so much more.
I will say the new Childish Gambino album is unbelievably good. I have listened to that a lot in the past couple weeks. That guy's amazing.
God, he's so cool.
He's pretty good at everything.
Guy's so good at what he does.
And I mean, the best thing he's done, come on now, is definitely Community.
Oh, he was great. Is Troy in Community? Troy, he was so good.
Troy and Albert in the morning. Oh man, so good.
He can reinvent himself.
Many times. Atlanta's also a phenomenal show.
Atlanta is incredible. The This Is America video is it's one of the best pieces of media that I think have been put out in the past 10 years. Is that music video? But yeah, I'll tell you, if you haven't listened to that new album of his, every track is a banger, and it swings from some tracks sound like you're like, is this Weezer? It sounds like Weezer right now, like from the 90s, or it'll like go into like a more rap,
he can sing,
genre,
he can
or
rap.
into R&B. He covers so many genres in that album. It's really great.
Yeah. For me, I mean, I'm a big Slim Shady fan. So you gotta listen to Marshall Mathers LP. Thriller is also album top to bottom. One that I like was kind of my generation that like you don't realize how many songs they put out from that one album was Usher's Confessions. That literally put out songs for 7 years. Yeah. Off one album. It's kind of like Luke Combs. He's put out songs off his first album for a very long time.
Yeah. When you
Garth Brooks was also the same way.
Yep.
So it's like you experience these generational talents. My wife loves Adele, so Adele is always on the record player at home. Chris Stapleton is always on the record player at home.
Stapleton, I listen to a lot of Chris Stapleton. Honestly, I probably listen to more. I'm blanking on his name right now. Cutting Grass, that album. Sturgill Simpson. Man, that guy is a great songwriter too.
Well, and like the power of Kentucky country music.
Yeah. Man, taking it in a direction that it has never gone before either.
It's wild between him and obviously Stapleton and the other guy, Tyler Childers. Not the other guy. He is definitely
the other guy.
Not the other guy.
Great movie, by the way, if you've not watched it.
We got a lot of conversations going here. Our brains are spinning. We got lots of things going through our heads.
When's the last time you had your desk pop? Just last week. Hey, I just did my first desk pop. What? Oh man, jump for the bushes. Oh God, what a funny movie. Mark Wahlberg, Will Ferrell. Gotta go get his gat. Oh man, I'm all over the place right now. But this speaks to, there's a lot of things that happen in bourbon that connect us to pop culture. We've talked about this many times with Jack Daniels, but this brand, Heaven's Door, is one that connects to one of the icons of pop culture. Whether it's music, whether it's art, whether it's philanthropy, Bob Dylan and the team have created a brand and a destination now that people want to be associated with. So, how does Bob Dylan kind of fit into everything Heaven's Door? I think that's one of the mysteries of the brand a little bit.
Yeah. The easiest way for me to answer that question is kind of turn it around and say, Bob Dylan doesn't really fit into our brand. We fit into that idea of Bob Dylan. Everything kind of goes back to what I call like the restless spirit of Bob Dylan, which sometimes I say and people are like, is he dead? No, he's not dead. The guy Bob's 82 now and still performs like 100 dates a year.
That's wild.
Is a very prolific writer and artist. Everything that we do really leads back to him and his sort of shadow that so much of our culture lives under, and the things that he's accomplished, everything from the aesthetics of the bottle to, the names, Ascension, Revival, Revelation, Refuge, kind of these big overarching themes of just what it means to be a person, right? And it's almost like a religious, we're saying, we're in a church right now, but it's kind of a great fit for the brand because there is almost this non-secular, very important pathos that comes from Bob Dylan and how important he's been just in social instances, right? Like social change in this country. So I think everything that we do really leads back to him and just the iconic sort of brand that he built for himself. Now, the liquid itself, he's really good. I mean, Bob will tell you, like, he doesn't make whiskey, right? He's not showing up to the distillery in Pleasureville and distilling or anything, but he is very, very much involved with the direction of the brand. We send him samples, they taste it, his whole team tastes it. They send us notes back just like we do in our QC and in our internal tastings. And really, for future releases or where we want to take the brand, he's very much involved in that. We just did a little bit of a rebrand, kind of shrunk down those labels a little bit. The labels come from the gates right? Those huge black iron gates he does called Black Buffalo Ironworks. Yeah, the guy just is unstoppable. He just doesn't stop. He's not only a songwriter, he's also like making big wrought iron gates. But we kind of shrunk those labels down a little bit, and then we put names on those bottles like Ascension, Revival. A lot of that came from his writings and from the direction that he wanted the brand to take.
Yeah, I mean, it's like he's been producing things for decades.
Yeah,
it's that generation has been able to withstand the test of time, and that's been I think the staying power of him is like people even younger than I am know who Bob Dylan is.
Yes,
right. That's wild, and now. Bourbon can be everlasting. Bourbon can be a legacy piece, for him. His music will always live on. His writings and his art will always live on. But bourbon is another thing that he can show his artistic side in that I think is very unique and very creative. And today we've gotten to kind of talk a little bit and sip through some of these whiskeys. And there's a new one that's about to release. We would do a disservice if we didn't kind of lead with the next big release. So what's happening, with the brand and the next type of release that you all have coming out?
So what you've got, I think we're all drinking it now, is our new Decade series. So once a year, we would release Decade. Decade is always at least 10 years old and always 100 proof. This is the last decade. And in fact, we kind of call it the last decade internally. It sort of mirrored our early core products. So when the brand started, there was Bob's team had Bob and his team had wanted to start something called bootleg whiskey, which we still release bootleg once a year, right? But when he teamed up with Mark Bushala, who owns Spirits Investment Partners, he used to own Angel's Envy, and he had just sold to Bacardi, and I think he was looking for another kind of whiskey brand to start or get back in the industry, and so they hooked up, and he said, the LTOs are great, like doing these one-time releases are awesome, but let's build a brand in like core bottles that everybody can get. So we started with the Tennessee bourbon, we had a double barrel, and then we had the rye whiskey finished in Vosges French oak barrels. And so the Decade series actually mirrored that. The first Decade we put out a couple years ago was the 10-year version of that Tennessee bourbon. The one that we put out the year after that was a rye that mirrored the rye that we had. It was a 10-year-old version of that rye, which was also delicious. This year, the final one that we put out is mirroring the double barrel, which we call Revelation now. And so this one should start hitting shelves. I mean, really, at the end of the summer, you should see this nationwide. It's 10 years old. That is the minimum age in this. I think some of the whiskey is actually closer to 12 years old. There's 2 ryes and 2 bourbons in this. They're all distilled and aged separately. One of the ryes is also finished in sherry casks. So I think it's got a breakdown. That's what I kind of love about this bottles. I don't have to memorize it. It's on the side there. Yeah. But that sherry cask, when you have that in, all of a sudden you're kind of looking, this is like a triple finish because we blend them all together and we finish them in a toasted barrel for like another year. So it really kind of helps blend those flavors, add a creaminess to it. Toasted barrels, I think, are difficult still for your everyday consumer to kind of wrap their head around. More and more people are using toasted barrels. That was something I got very kind of intimately involved with when I was at Rabbit Hole, because everything we're using there was out of Kelvin, so they're all kind of out of those toasted barrels. Really understanding what just a toasted barrel does to a product. I think people hear toasted and they think sweeter, and it's usually kind of the opposite. It sort of dries it out a little bit, but then it also kind of gives you a little bit of a creamy mouthfeel, and I think that's really what that did for these 4 whiskeys being blended together. Brought them together, married them together, and added an extra layer of sort of texture on it. So when you drink this, not only are you getting the influence of 2 ryes and 2 bourbons and a sherry finish and things like that, you're also getting the influence of that toasted barrel finish, which adds to the creamy texture and dries it up a little bit, so it's not so overbearingly sweet.
Yeah, I mean, it's got a really robust mash bill, right?
Yeah.
Because like the oldest whiskey in this is 13 years old.
Yeah.
So, or bourbon, let me say that, at 80% of the blend. So, I mean, you're getting a really robust bourbon, and the next oldest bourbon is 12 years old. So, I mean, it's not like this is a young pup. What's the SRP on that?
It's always 100.
Always 100.
Decade is always 100, which $10 a year, and that where it used to be.
That's pretty easy to remember. $100, 100 proof,
10 years, 100 proof. Yep.
Yeah. And I mean, you're getting a lot of value for that.
Well, like sometimes you get whiskeys and they're kind of sharp edged.
Yeah.
And this one just like rolls over the tongue, which is super nice. I mean, I'm getting a lot of that rye spice.
Yeah.
But it's not overbearing. But I'm getting a little bit of sweetness too. But again, it's not overbearing. And so it's like kind of like you round off the edges.
That sherry, I think, rounds off probably the 95.5 rye that's in there. And there's a slight touch of Canadian. So you're getting a little bit of that from that like baking spice out of that, I believe. But I think that sherry really cuts the 95.5 and gives you more of that plum fig kind of note versus the,
minty green.
Yeah, minty green.
Which after 10 years, you're not getting a lot of. But
No.
yeah.
Well, it balances out at that point. I think it's something that, I'm sure I've talked about when I've been on Lens before, but it's something I end up usually talking about is that I am about balance. I like balance. At this point, like, who am I? I'm not anybody special. But I have had a chance to taste a lot of whiskey, and you get kind of jaded. I think sometimes you're like, okay, yeah, more vanilla, more caramel, great. Like I've tasted it, right? And sometimes I do want something that has an outlying flavor, is a little funky, just kind of shock my palate a little bit. But when I want to relax and I want to enjoy bourbon and not try and like tear it apart and analyze it, this is what I go for. I go for something that has a lot of balance.
Yeah.
So really I'm probably not really supposed to pick favorites, but this kind of is like my favorite thing that we've done so far. I really, really like this.
Yeah, I mean, that would be the way I describe this bourbon whiskey, like
Balanced.
together is balanced. Yeah. And I think people think that's a cop-out, but it's like, that's what you're striving for. If you're blending, you're trying to find balance amongst the blend.
Well, it's like if you're eating, right? You got a meal and you're like, oh, I taste too much lemon, or I taste too much pepper, or I taste too much spice. Like, you don't really want that. Like, yes, you want a little bit of everything, a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper, but you don't want a gallon of garlic in your dish.
On
So it's
paper,
Unless you're trying to get rid of vampires.
well, yeah, if you're trying to ward off,
you have to think about, right?
Yeah. Or you could come to church.
Amen.
On paper, balance seems very boring.
Yeah.
On paper, it seems very boring. In practice and in execution, it is anything but. And taking it back to, to your point, the culinary side of it, great chefs strive for balance. I'm going to shout out somebody, right? I'm going to shout out 610 Magnolia, which is easily one of the best.
Be there next week.
Yeah, going next week.
This is unbelievable, right? And if you've ever been to 610 and you're doing just their normal tasting menu, you're not doing one of their special, event menus or something, they always start with the amuse-bouche. And it is that one bite, and it's supposed to be like a BLT, but it's this one bite. And it is probably the most perfect bite, like one bite you can get in Louisville, is that little BLT that they do. It is phenomenal. And it's one of those things where every time I go, I'm lucky enough, I know their GM really well. Me and Liz go back quite a ways. And she always kind of knows if I go and I take Kyla, we're having a date night, she usually like gives us a couple extra of them because we know we want to eat more of those. But it is really like the perfect bite. And when you start to really distill how hard that is to do and the story behind that, it was Ed Lee had, he every day on the line before he started work, he would eat a BLT. And that was his thing. That was his like get going. He'd eat the BLT and then he was ready for work and get on the line and start cooking and be an amazing chef that he is. And so you have that history behind that bite, but also they've got to make it to where this little, God, what do you think it is? Like 1 inch square bite or whatever, that you taste the bread, you taste the bacon, you taste the tomato, you taste maybe the mayonnaise. It's like every single piece of it. It's what's the thing in Willy Wonka, like the everlasting gobstopper? No, not that. What's the gum she chews, and it's like the whole Thanksgiving meal or whatever?
Yeah.
That is that amuse-bouche to me. It has such good balance, but to get there, the things they have to go through are very, very difficult to create that. And then on your palate, the things that it does are pretty magical. That's kind of how I feel about bourbon. And really any spirit, from beer to wine to bourbon to baijiu, whatever, if it's truly balanced and it is hitting bitter, sweet, acrid, salty, whatever, and it's hitting all of those and activating every single part of your palate, that's really mastery. And just to your point, blending and creating those flavors out of a bunch of different barrels, that is so hard to do.
Yeah.
That is so hard to do. So that's really when I look at this decade, this double barrel decade, and I taste it. And coming from me that, I think you all know this about me, like I'm kind of a low proof guy. I don't really drink things over 100 proof very often. I don't really like things that are ultra aged a lot of times. I think too much oak, it gets kind of overbalanced and it can get bitter and acrid. This at 10 plus years and at 100 proof is kind of perfect. It's kind of perfect.
Yeah.
It's nice.
Yeah. It's a very nice, and like you can tell it was cut just right. You know what I mean? I think blending gets a bad rap in America, where the rest of the world, like that's all they do is blend.
Yeah.
Like they're using aged barrels, and so they have aged spirit, but they're using second fill barrels. They're not using new fill, so you're not getting all of the same extraction. And so I think we have to start to appreciate as American consumers the artistry of blending.
Yeah.
Right. Johnny Walker is the biggest brand in the world. Like, it is a blended Scotch. Like,
which is really a dirty word in Scotland. I mean, you're just kind of saying like it kind of has bad rap in here in the US. In Scotland, the word blended really kind of has a bad rap too. It's really where it came from. But Johnny Walker is a very balanced, very easy to drink whiskey. And that's why it does so well. Jack Daniels, we were just talking about Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels is one of those things to me where it's, no matter where you get Jack Daniels anywhere in the world, it tastes exactly like Jack Daniels. And that's kind of a feat of engineering to me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for consistency and balance, and blending is the key to that.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah. I think, we've talked about small scale blending with people like Hidden Barn to large scale people like Chris Fletcher and Jack Daniels. Like, it's consistency is key. And I think that's what we don't always appreciate. It's like, oh, I can grab that shelfer. Well, that shelfer from yesteryear, 4 or 5 years ago to now you're going to taste minuscule differences.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we have to appreciate as drinkers. And when you release an LTO, and I don't think this is an LTO.
This is an LTO.
Yeah. So when you release an LTO, you want it to stand above. And so you're looking for ultra fine. You kind of want it to be boring from like, is there any spiky notes or anything? You want something kind of across the board. And I think that's where like the enthusiast probably gets a little bit of a bad rap because they're looking for the outlier. They're looking for the 195 proof bourbon.
Like melt your face.
That allows you to breathe fire because they've been watching too much Game of Thrones. Like I don't need that. Like to your point, Scott and I are 115 and under pretty much exclusively. Unless, that's the sample we're drinking that night.
Yeah.
And then it takes a little while to warm up to it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you best believe it. We're drinking something else a lot of times.
I've had whiskeys that were hazmat, like 130, 140 proof, that I was surprised that it didn't taste as hot as it should have been. But it's hard for me to drink above that. I would always kind of get made fun of, anytime I'm in QC or tasting panels, because my notes are just constantly like mouth burn. And they're like, well, it's straight from the cask, Adam. It's 130 proof. It's going to have mouth burn. I'm like, that's great. It's not for me. It's not for me. Also, at this point in my career, I have nothing to prove to anybody. I don't really like to say, oh man, I drink 140 proof, only because that's where all the flavor is. It's not really true. It's not really true.
You can taste more imperfections with more water. I mean, that's one of the things that I gleaned from Jimmy or from Eddie Russell when he was talking when we went to Wild Turkey recently. He's like, yeah, you can drink high proof whiskey, high proof bourbon, but you're going to taste the imperfections when you cut it with water. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense.
That's why you water things down to like 30 proof on these QC tables. Also you don't want to have to like taste through like 27 barrels before lunch and like not be able to feel your feet. So it's also good to like water it down to that too. But it shows the imperfections. It kind of shows you where you need to adjust things in your process.
Yeah.
I think for my birthday, so my birthday's in June, and I'd gone out with a few friends, and one of my friends was like, hey, you gotta try something I was picked up. And he poured me the Four Roses Father's Day bottle, and he handed me that glass. And just by looking at it, I was like, oh God, this is this is going to hurt. Like I could tell. And I took a sip and I was like, oh my God, and it was good. I mean, I like Four Roses, but immediately it was like, I can't drink this whole thing. Like I can't drink this whole thing. It's like, what is the proof on that? And it's like 137 proof or something like that. I was like, buddy, this is one of my good friends. I was like, you know me, that is not my style at all.
Yeah.
He said, Happy Father's Day.
Let that sit in the glass for about 3 days. Yeah. Let the alcohol vapors.
It was. I will say, I went back to it, and I had it. Yeah, I'm sure this is some of your listeners are gonna be like, "Oh God, why would you do that?" I had it in some water too. It was very good. It was very good. When you proofed it down to like 100 proof.
Well, I think that's why I like 100 proof. It's like you put it in a glass, and you know that it's not the alcohol content that is impacting what your palate is doing.
Yeah.
So. I mean, I've said this about bottled and bond forever, but 100 proof, I know what the alcohol burn should be.
Yes.
So I can appreciate other things outside of like what most people say, like, how do you drink that bourbon? How do you do all I taste is rubbing alcohol and burn. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe set a level, like, if you do it at 6 year, everything you try is 6 years, and maybe you can adjust proof from there, or you set everything at the same proof, then you can really start to compare.
I always have the same question for everybody when I kind of get into this conversation, and it's a very simple question, but I think it sort of illustrates my point pretty well. What does ethanol taste like?
You drank gas much?
Well, that's the thing. It literally is nothing. It's vodka. Vodka is supposed to taste neutral. Yeah. Ethanol doesn't have flavor. Now, I'm not saying just because it's high proof, it's not going to have any different flavor. There's a lot of other processes to it, right? And it's where the barrel was and how old it is and all those great things. Well, the barrel, I mean, there are a million things you could say, right? But it's not the proof specifically that is changing the flavor. It's just not. It's just not. It is changing the body, right? It's changing the finish in terms of when I breathe out, am I gonna like struggle to breathe?
Yeah.
It's 140 proof.
Gasping for air.
I mean, that's it. The ethanol doesn't have flavor. It's all the other things in there you're looking for. So don't place traditionally, and this is, I've not done research on this, and this is just my opinion, but it makes sense in my head. Traditionally, all you could tell from a bottle of bourbon were two things: the age and the proof, right? And I don't know if it's like a Western thing or if it's a worldwide thing, but I feel like in our culture, we look for higher numbers. The higher the number, the better it's got to be in all things in our world, unless you're playing golf, right? That's like the only thing it doesn't matter. So I think that kind of got stuck in our psyches of, oh man, it's got to be 23 years old. It's got to be 170 proof. There's a lot of beautiful things in there that are under 5 years old and under 90 proof. There's a lot of beautiful things out there.
The majority of the world drinks 80 proof whiskey.
Absolutely.
Just saying that out into the space. let that be what you may want it to be. But no, I think you're making some good points, and I think it's points that Scott and I echo is, hey, drink whatever you want to drink, because you all are going to produce whatever you all want to produce for people of that persuasion, as well as you're going to produce whiskeys for people at the 100 proof persuasion and maybe lower. So I think that's great. So you want to pause here? We can pour some bootleg, maybe a little more water.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll pause. All right. So we got our glasses filled up with kind of the halo to this brand. And it's really one of the original ideas for Heaven's Door was this bootleg bourbon. So can you tell us about how bootleg kind of came about and why that was prominent, and then a little bit about this whiskey in particular?
Yeah, of course. So the bootleg series itself, so what we're drinking right now is volume 5. Volume 6 will come out at the end of this year. This was the original brand from Bob Dylan. He wanted to create bootleg whiskey. He sang about bootleg whiskey a lot in a few of his songs. And so it was a really nice kind of cross section between the artistry of music and literature and American whiskey. So when you look at the bottles, they always have these original art pieces from Bob, kind of like how our core bottles will always have parts of the gates. These bottles are also always adorned with like his artwork. So this one is, I think this is the one that's is it the motel? It's got the motel on there. Yeah. So every year we put this out. It's a different piece of art from Bob that we imprint on the label. This is where he was going originally. We still do it once a year. They're usually ultra aged. So I think the last year was like an 11, or the year before last was like an 11-year weeded, finished in Speyside barrels. It was awesome because I'm a peat guy. I love peat, so that was really, really nice. This one's an 18-year-old Kentucky bourbon that we finished in, I believe it's Rioja casks. I think it's, or vermouth cask. Can't remember off the top of my head. And then this year, I think is going to be in like a 12 or 13-year-old bourbon finished in a specialty cask as well. So they're always sort of exploring a little bit extra age and then a little bit of a cask finish. And it's really about the artistry of it. To be very transparent, right? Our brand is not 18 years old, right? Our brand's not even 11 years old. The whiskey itself is sourced. The finishing is us. And I think that is something that Bob really likes because it's taking something and putting your spin on it and getting creative with something and turning into something that you own, right? So everything from the bottle design to the liquid itself really takes that spin of creativity. And again, back to that kind of restless spirit of Bob Dylan, like always wanting to evolve, always wanting to adapt and be ahead of the curve when it comes to your art.
Yeah, no, I think that's really, really interesting. And one of the questions, some finishing needs to die, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But like this is artful finishing.
Yes.
Right? Like if I see me personally, and I love every brand.
Can I just say what I think you're going to say?
Sure?
Is it Ambarana?
Yeah.
Okay.
It should die on a vine. Let cachaça be cachaça. And can we stay away from those? Like
personally, I like the cinnamon red hots, but I'm kind of with you. I'm like that with Pedro Jimenez sherry. If I never taste PX sherry again in my life, I will be fine. And it's not that there's anything wrong with it. I blew my palate out on Derringer at Rabbit Hole. I drank Derringer just constantly. And now I'm like so burnt out on PX sherry. Yeah.
Yeah. You would be until you drank some Tamdu, Scotch single malt. They're finished in.
Oh, I have not had that one. I have not had. Is it good?
Was that PX or is that Oloroso?
I'm pretty sure it's PX, but it's fine sherry whiskey. But anywho, I get what you're saying. Like there's some finishing just needs to be delicate. I think we need to find ways to, instead of accentuate the finish, find the delicate balance of it. Again, like back to the decades, find the way to round it. And where it's not the main focal point, but it is an accentuator, or brings up, it's the vibrato, or it's the accent on the crescendo to a song, right? Like, but it doesn't need to be the whole song.
I see what you did there.
Salt on top of the brownie.
I see what you did there.
I know.
Nice.
I
like that.
I talked music.
Yeah, I talked brownies. No, it's the finishing salt, or it's the I don't know, the glaze or whatever you put on something, right? It shouldn't be the focus of it.
He just brought up food. You know what that does to me, right?
This is a role reversal here, because this is normally Jake bringing up the food and the.
Yeah, but I mean, I was talking to the tuba guy, so I figured we're talking Bob Dylan. I figured I'd talk music, I was first chair orchestra, all state, baby.
I figure your listeners really tuned in, not really to hear about whiskey, but to hear about the tuba.
Yeah,
that's why they tuned into this episode.
They heard, and they.
If you haven't watched Drumline at least once a year for the last 2 decades, I don't know.
Must-watch movie.
It is a must-watch movie. Nick Cannon, only thing that's watchable that he's ever done, and it's a tuba thing. Shouty.
So it's Jurassic Park for me. What was yours?
That was American Psycho.
American Psycho, and yours is Drumline.
Yeah. That's it.
That classic Nick Cannon.
Nick Cannon filmography.
Yeah. All-time greats.
All-time greats when somebody snaps on your snare drum and you just punch them in the face.
That's like cinematography 101.
A lot of really good life lessons in that movie, I'll tell you.
There is. If you ever want to know what an actual marching band should sound like, you want to go to the South, because they know how to do that thing.
This is very true. You ever been to the Battle of the Bands?
Yes, I have.
Oh, man. First of all, HCBUs have the best bands. They have the best bands. And this is coming from a guy who marched at University of Kentucky. We had a good band. It was always a big band. But man, those HCBUs
could always be better.
They have the best bands, man. Battle of the Bands is always amazing.
Yeah, my buddy did drum corps in high school, and he was on the Blue Devils or whatever. And he was like, "You've never seen competition. People from around the world are in the country flying and practicing and then going home." I'm like, just to play an instrument?
Yeah.
That's impressive.
It's It's a lifestyle.
Yeah, it is. It's a tuba thing. Shout it.
It's a stupid thing.
So yeah, I mean, it's a definitely an interesting purview of life. And by the way, Silence of the Lambs is also a great movie, but Shawshank Redemption was the movie that I chose. Actually, guys,
Drum on.
Nick Cannon, you've got 20 kids. But this, I feel like accentuates the base bourbon. Like going back to that conversation, it accentuates the base bourbon really nice, and it gives you a little bit of, hey, I'm here, but like you can taste the aged spirit in it. Scott, like, is this hitting your palate whatsoever? Because you're not normally the finished whiskey guy.
No, I mean, I'm not, but like this, I feel like if it was not finished, it would probably be way too over oaked. Like, I feel like with the finishing, it really does help round out some of those oak notes that are there that you taste, the woodiness, but it kind of makes you want to like go back for another drink, be like, what am I tasting? Like, what is that?
Really, really a lot of depth on this, a lot of complexity. This is not a bourbon that I would recommend going home, opening up, and just relaxing for the sake of relaxing. This is a bourbon that you drink when you want to get nerdy, when you want to get into the complexities of American whiskey and finishing. You know, we just kind of talked about, how difficult blending is. Aging is also very difficult. Everybody always thinks they want the oldest, oakiest bourbon out there until they've had the oldest, oakiest bourbon out there. And then they realize that 99% of those barrels just taste like you're chewing on an oak branch, right? So you've got to figure out something to do with it. This one, I've tasted the version of this without the finish, right? The 18-year-old, and it is very good. It is too oaky for me personally. I generally don't drink a lot of whiskey that's over about 12 years old because it's, again, I like balance, and it gets very outside of balance for me. That being said, there is something to be said for going to a bottle like this to challenge yourself to say, okay, I'm a whiskey nerd. What flavors can I really taste? And, get something like this and sit at a table with 4 or 5, 10, 20 of your friends or whatever and taste through them and talk about it. Yeah. Don't do it in the dark. Don't do it siloed. This is a great bottle to taste with people because you learn from other people's palates. I have a big blind spot in my palate for kind of musty flavors, not like bad, like off flavors, but when things are like deep leather and mahogany and things like that. I have a blind spot. It's hard for me to taste that. So when someone says like wet basement, I'm like, okay, I kind of understand where you're coming from. And I learn from people who can taste that in their palate in group tastings. So this is that one that you want to do with other people. And it's always good to have a bottle like this that you can share with your friends because maybe they've never tasted something like this, but you can really learn a lot from other people's palates on a bottle like this.
And it's a badass bottle to
it is
put on your bar.
Very badass bottle.
It kind of gives you that vibe of like ceramic decanters of like the 1980s, which is pretty cool. Yeah. Or, the true bootleggers where they were doing like milk jugs. Mm-hmm. So it does give you that vibe, which is super interesting. I feel like, to your point, I have nothing to prove at this point at all. But like when I sniff this whiskey and they tell you put your schnoz right all up in that thing. And I get in there, I do get that punch of like alcohol at first, which I don't know the proof on this, but it does have a little bit of like, you get the alcohol vapors. Yeah. But then once you get past that, there's a component that's really complex to me. Like you mentioned, of like cream of wheat type of like brown sugar stuff that makes me want to come back to this. But when you talk about like wet basement or like musty rick house, I feel like because we've been in them so often, it's like those notes come easy to us.
Yeah.
Like when I get like fresh rick house as like a tasting note, they're like, are you going around tasting? No, but I'm like, I'm breathing the air and I'm chewing on it.
That's 90% of the taste, isn't it? The smell.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? The really aromas of it. Leather is that thing where it's like, okay, yeah, you could say it tastes like leather, but it's not like chewing on leather. It's taking what the aroma of leather is and putting that on your palate. Like
what kid hasn't chewed on their baseball glove at some point? I mean, let's be real honest. Like the strings that are hanging there. Like what kid didn't do that in the dugout?
The first time you eat it, it's not very good. About the fifth time you eat it,
boy, it is delicious.
It's delightful.
But it really is. It's like the aroma carries over to a lot of the finish too. It's like what's left when the burn is gone, when the alcohol vapors have dissipated. What's left? Yeah. And it's that finish that you're really just carrying through.
And you're resetting your olfactories every time. Like, and there's an art to tasting. And we've tasted with Peggy, and we've tasted with pick a person. I feel like we've tasted with them at this point, Nancy Fraley, and it's like. It's here to here. And I pointed to my nose, to my mouth, and then to my esophagus. Mm-hmm. And like if it's 80 to 90% here, I can definitely agree with that. But like the mouthfeel and the palate, I think that's where I get my recall from. Like, was it grandma's pie? Was it the baseball glove? Was it, your grandpa's pipe tobacco that you kind of like inhaled and you're like, I get that a little bit. Like those are the things like you get a lot of recall from that taste and texture feel from a drinking perspective, which is
sense memory I think is so strong. It is the strongest on things that aren't visual. Like your sense memory doesn't really rely on the visuals in your life, right? It's really about smells and tactile things, like the feeling. There's even things that probably happened to you when you were 3 or 4 that you can't really put your finger on and think about, but like every once in a while you have those deja vu moments, and it's something that you're smelling or it's something that you're touching, and you're like, this is triggering like a core memory in my mind, and I cannot put my finger on it, but it's very strong and it really does have a hold on you. And I think that's really where the true artistry of whiskey comes in. It's not always about pushing the envelope in terms of finishes or cool packaging or things like that. It's about keying in on people's sense memories. Yeah. That's really what it's about. And culinary is the same way. Yeah. Right? It's at those key sense memories that you have.
Yeah. So I'm glad that we brought this conversation up, because I've been waiting to say this to somebody that would appreciate it. But
he didn't say it to me. Obviously, he didn't care. He didn't think I'd appreciate it.
I didn't. It wasn't one of those like one of those mental thoughts. Like you're like, I need to pick up the phone and call and tell somebody. But now that we're talking about this,
dick.
But I had an old fashioned the other day that reminded me of something, and it's so weird. But it was a cherry popsicle. Yeah. But it wasn't the cherry popsicle that was the important part. It was when you finish the cherry popsicle and you get down to the wooden stick.
Yeah.
And so like. You tasted the oak, you tasted the wood, but you also tasted that like the remnants of the cherry. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I don't remember if I like this or not, but it was like immediately triggered in my mind. Like that's cherry popsicle stick.
Yeah. Sometimes it's not about what you like. It's about what it is that you're tasting in terms of like, do I like it or do I not like it? Sometimes it's really about what does it remind you of and what kind of mental space does it put you in. Sometimes it's harder to say things that you like than it is. Sorry, it's harder to say things that you don't like than it is things that you like. At least it is for me, right? It's usually I don't like this, I don't like that.
Positive Adam.
I'm the Ted Lasso of bourbon, apparently. It's very positive. But yeah, I mean, sometimes it is about that thing. It's like, okay, that wasn't the best part of the popsicle, was the stick. But it's the part that stuck with you and is part of your childhood. And if you have that situation where you are tasting that and it brings you back, that's pretty awesome, honestly. Yeah.
Because, I mean, it just reminded me of like running around as a kid. Like you finished the popsicle and you didn't want to throw it in the yard or whatever, but you like waited to throw it away. Mm-hmm. That was like the memory. So it was very surreal. It was a little bit weird, but
it's very cool. I remember that. And I'm like, that's one step away from a tongue depressor for a...
But it was cherry flavored, so you had like the remnants of the popsicle.
Well, so now the balsa wood that they give you to like test you for strep throat is flavored.
I don't think I've had a strep test, and
no, I only know that because they strep tested my son earlier this year.
Yeah, they're all flavored.
He was influenced by Drumline, if you didn't know. So, at the end of the day, whiskey recalls a lot of conversation. Whiskey makes you feel the environment around you and the passion around you. And I think Bob would appreciate this conversation because we've talked a little bit about food. We've talked a little bit about art. We've talked a little bit about cinematography and music, but ultimately is all related back to creating a product that people can be proud of because it has artistry behind it.
Yeah.
So with that being said, this is the first of many conversations because there will be more whiskey that is produced, and there's got to be an on-site, tour once the visitor center is open. And we'll tease that for another time, but it'll be open sometime, maybe in 24, maybe in 25, just whenever.
Yeah, we're looking for the distillery in Pleasureville to be open to the public at the end of September, I think, is kind of where we're keyed in right now. If it happens, that's great. If it doesn't, we'll push it to 2025. But I think that's kind of what we're keying on right now, to have that distillery open then. And then this, the Last Refuge, have it completely open to the public with a tasting center in 2025. Yeah.
So you got a lot coming on or coming down the pipe, and that gives us more opportunity to come back and talk. Adam, where can people find more about Heaven's Door so that they can be up to date on everything that's happening here at the Last Refuge, as well as what's happening out in Pleasureville?
So you can go to our website, just heavensdoor.com, or tag us at Heaven's Door on Instagram. We're also on Facebook. I'm usually floating around there. You can find me at Bourbon Tuba. So I'm usually...
It's a tuba thing, shouty.
Tuba thing, shouty. I'm usually floating around the distilleries or the church here, or out and about in the rest of the country, educating about the whiskey. So you can find more there as well. But be on the lookout on our socials and our website for new and continued developments as we move forward.
Well, we appreciate you doing this twice in one setting. We really appreciate it. And Scott, next time, make sure the mic's turned on. Because it's a mic thing, shouty. Well, Adam, as always, it's great to have you on. We really appreciate it. And everybody, we will catch you next time. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Bourbon Lens. Make sure you're connected with Scott and I via social media on Instagram, X, and Facebook. We'd love to connect. And if you're more the professional type, follow us over on LinkedIn. If you want to know more about Bourbon Lens, make sure you're subscribed to our weekly newsletter, The Weekly Pour. For exclusive content and more, check out Patreon. Follow us there at Bourbon Lens. And last but not least, on your favorite podcast listening app, make sure you're subscribed, because every Monday, Scott and I release a podcast, and we would love to have you here listening to the newest features and the newest whiskey news. And until next time, cheers.